So, good morning. Welcome to this second talk in our course, Introduction to Indian Knowledge Systems, with the living traditions of Sanskrit as the theme for this year. Today is National Youth Day. It is Swami Vivekananda's birthday. I think he would have been delighted to see this title, Sanskrit, a Living Tradition, because he said a lot of very interesting things about Sanskrit and all the cultural baggage it has carried through the millennia. So we're delighted to have with us Professor Srinivas Reddy, who is an old hand at IIT Gandhinagar, and he has been lecturing in this course quite a few times. As we say traditionally, he needs no introduction. I will simply mention that he's a well-known scholar of Sanskrit, classical Tamil, classical Telugu, and also a professional sitarist, incidentally. And with this, I will invite Srini, as we call him, to give his talk on Sanskrit, the living tradition.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Michelle. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. And I thank you for always inviting me to the IKS series and to all of you who helped organize it, Mana, Devarsh. Everything looks good. So I know it takes a lot to put all of this together and to organize all these talks. So I really appreciate your efforts. And I'm glad we're recording all these so that we have this for posterity. And I will present some ideas. I hope we can have general discussion. I'm not an expert really in this field, I would say, in terms of, at least from a grammatical perspective, although I think grammar is really important to our discussion today. And we heard some of that yesterday in Kapilji's talk. And so I hope that we can just have a discussion, general discussion. So I'll throw out some ideas that I've been thinking about. You mentioned it was Vivekananda's celebration day today, and he did say many things about Sanskrit. One of the most recurrent things I think he said about the Sanskrit or the Sanskrit language is its prestige, its power, and that is a main theme that will go through some of the ideas that I'll present today, because that really is the heart of what Sanskrit has come to be as it grew and what it remains to be. It's a language of some, and I don't want to say sacred here necessarily, but some power. It has a certain kind of authority, a certain position of respect, prestige. These ideas, this kind of reverence for the language is essential to how it has functioned in our culture and functions outside of our culture throughout different parts of the world. So this point is really important. And in fact, I think that is why you could call it still a living tradition. Although, as you'll see, I do have some maybe contrary points to make. And sometimes when you make the opposite point, it's just as relevant as the positive point. My guru often used to say, anytime you make an argument, always try to also argue the exact opposite of that argument. And many times you'll find that both of those things kind of lead to a similar place. But arguing from both sides of the equation leads to, understanding subtleties of the argument and subtleties of how, any kind of principle or proposition can be explained. So with that basic introduction, we'll go through a few slides that I put together. And if at any time you have a question or want to clarify something, please raise your hand and we can, pause for a quick discussion. But I'll try to go through the slides fairly, quickly, and so we can maximize the amount of discussion. TK? Good? Okay. So why is Sanskrit a living tradition? That's the question that we're going to answer. Three things in the subtitle that I think are really important to think about as we move forward. And I'll kind of return to that theme, and there's kind of two parts to this presentation, so I'll return to that in the second part. But production, commentary, and translation. So first we have to think about the context, the provenance, the reasons why something is produced as a text in Sanskrit, how that text moves to be interpreted through a large body of commentatorial literature, which oftentimes was in Sanskrit. And then quite a later phase when instead of writing commentaries on the text, people were actually translating the text into other languages, because that represents a moment where now the Sanskrit tradition is not writing commentary on itself, but other languages are writing commentary about Sanskrit. And this is also important to remember. So before we get to that kind of section of the text, we really have to understand, what are we talking about when we say Sanskrit? Are we talking about a spoken language? Are we talking about a literary language that we write in? These are really, really important fundamental concepts to think about, because actually there's not much of a definitive answer that we can give to this even. There's a lot of scholarly debate on these issues. So with that, let's move to the next slide. Let's see if I can get this to work. So first thing is, when we say Sanskrit, when I say Sanskrit, this is not an Indian word, actually. Sanskritam is the Indian word. Sanskrit is the word that people use in English to talk about this Indian word. So even when we talk about Sanskrit literature, we're actually not using a Sanskrit word. In fact, when people say Sanskrit, you're not pronouncing it correctly, you must say Sanskrit. Then I say to them, well, now you're making me pronounce an English word with an Indian accent. So if you really want to say what Sanskrit is, it is Samskritam. And this word has to be understood at its basic meaning. It's a beautiful word. The basic root of this word is kr, to do. And then it has a prefix sam. And sam is a prefix that means, wholeness, perfection, totality, fullness. It has all of this connotation to it. So Samskrita means, and now I'll go back to saying Sanskrit all the time, but since we're speaking in English, and that of course is what I'm going to end my talk with. Why are we even having this conversation in a language like English? That's a big question to be thought about. It's like the elephant in the room that we don't want to actually even address, but we will address that. Why is it that we're sitting here in India speaking in English about Sanskrit language? Think about this. Now, Samskritam, basically Sanskrit means something that is done to perfection, something that is made and refined, fashioned. Matlab, it involves some kind of human ingenuity. It involves a type of, smoothing. Like if you think of like a diamond, when you find the diamond in the outside in the mines, it's unpolished. Samskrita is that polishing of the diamond to make it beautiful and shine. And that's what Sanskritam is. It's a polished language. It's something beautiful that has been refined. It has that meaning to it. And of course, as we'll talk about in a second, that is in contrast to Prakrits. Prakrit, on the other hand, also same root kr, to do, but has this prefix pra, which you could argue means many things, like everything in Sanskrit. As our teachers always said, there's a million ways to say the same thing in Sanskrit, and every word in Sanskrit means a million things. So Prakrit can mean a lot of things. As we know in modern Indian languages, we know this word means nature. Prakriti. Same way as Sanskrit is kind of refined and perfected, Prakrits are like the unpolished gems. They're beautiful. They just don't have maybe that real finesse to them, but they're very beautiful. And they evolve naturally as languages. And we'll talk about what that really means. But it's important to think about these two categories of languages, Samskrita and Prakrita. And we'll get more into it later, but Sanskritam is one. although I would argue that that's not true exactly either. And Prakrits are many. These are some of the distinctions we can draw between these languages: refinement, non-refinement, plurality, and singularity. All of these kinds of things will come into our discussion. So, to get more into what do we mean by this Sanskrit language, is this a liturgical language or a literary language? And what do I mean by liturgical? Liturgical means, for religious purposes. And if we think of like the root, the most fundamental stuff that we know about of this language, what is the root of this language? What is the oldest stuff we can find in this language? The Vedas. And the Vedas are, you could say, liturgical. That's the term they use in the West. So they're hymns. Hymns used to perform yajna. They're not, mahakavyas like Kalidasa. They're not natakas like Shakuntala. They are mantras. They are hymns to various nature gods, that are used for ritual purposes. That's the point. Vedas are ritual texts. And what's interesting about the Vedas is what? They're not written down. They only exist in an oral capacity. And oral, like listening, hearing, speaking, or listening capacity. In fact, it was considered absolutely incorrect to even write them down. Because to write it down takes it out of that space of the consciousness of that sound. Lipi, script, which we mentioned yesterday, is just a representation of sound. But it can never be the sound. The sound, Shabda Pradhana, that's what Vedas are. The sound was the important thing. Shabda here actually does mean sound. It means language, of course, also, but it really means the sound of the language. That's the point I'm trying to make. There's a sound that the language is making. This was the important thing. So then it became, okay, later on, evolved over time as we learn Upanishad, Brahmanas, Aranyakas, all of this stuff. And then it evolved more and more, and you could say there's a transition into more, narrativized type of writing. And then you can say, we have development of things like Kalidasa and plays and kavya and all this stuff. And then it becomes what we call literary. Literary matlab what? It means it's like expressing some, beauties of life, of the heart, of emotions, of, it becomes literature, what we think of, when we say great literature. That's kind of what we think about. So during all this period, there was also a movement from purely oral, sonic kind of language to a written language. I mean, we know Kalidasa, all of these guys were working in an oral atmosphere, let us say. But at some point, people started writing things down. There's debates about when that happened, when's the earliest evidence of that happening. Definitely, we know Kalidasa used the word that things were written down. So we know that probably there was some writing at that time. Whether or not they composed in that way is a different story. Poets often, maybe they had writing, but poets still composed in an oral way. So no matter how much writing and the written word got involved with the evolution of the Sanskrit language, orality was always a critically important part of that language's life. Now, the real question and the real big debate is, did people go around sitting or walking and speaking Sanskrit as a language of normal interaction? Like, how are you doing? How is your class? What's going on? Blah, blah, blah. All the basic things of a communicative verbal language. Was Sanskrit a language like that? There's a lot of debate on this issue. A lot of debate on this issue. I mean, now you might go and hear that there's a spoken Sanskrit class now going on. I would say that honestly, that's kind of like a reformulation of what might have been if it ever was. Certainly, I don't have any evidence that I can tell of like a continuous group of people speaking the Sanskrit language as their basic language that they live their life in. Another thing that I could be pretty confident about is Sanskrit was not even if, let's say, even if there was somebody or a community that was like that, I guarantee they knew other languages too. So that's the other important thing always to remember is India, especially, many cultures are like this, but India has always been and is very much still that way today. A polylingual type of language. Everyone is a polyglot in India. Almost every Indian, no matter what your education level, can speak 3 languages or get along in at least 3 languages, if not 4 or 5. Just by the nature of how our culture works. Now, I grew up in America. I mean, people are monolingual. Boss, they know English. They can barely even speak Spanish, which is very common. But, you know, bilingual is like, oh, wow, you speak another language? Amazing. For an Indian, it's like, you only speak 2 languages? What's wrong with you? This is also part of the system of languages that evolved in our culture. And one of the important things to remember within that modality of, you know, polylinguistic usage is you don't always have to understand everything. Nowadays, we think I need to know exactly what that guy is saying. I need to know the grammar of what that guy is saying. I mean, a lot of times people communicate without understanding everything, right? You've probably experienced this in your own life. This guy is saying, yes, yes, definitely. You might have some good friends. You don't understand half of what they're saying, but TK, something you understood and you're able to communicate. Or maybe a South Indian guy doesn't fully understand Hindi, like me. I don't half the things my friends say in Hindi, I'm just like, I don't exactly know what they're saying, but I know what they're saying. So language is more than just intelligibility of like grammatical forms. And in fact, an argument could be made that the fact that people don't know what Sanskrit means is also what gives it its power and its beauty. And we'll come back to this theme in a second. There's also the point about, is this Devavani? Is this the language that God spoke? Devanagari. Why do we call it Devanagari? Because it's Devanagaram. It was the lipi that we used in the, you know, city of the gods, somewhere in Amaralokam. Now, you can say, yes, I believe that. I believe that, you know, Indra and his people were speaking in Sanskrit, and somehow Shiva came and, you know, beat his Damaru, and then the Shiva Sutras came, and then Panini got this language. You can, no problem. I love those stories, man. Love mythology, love those stories. I don't particularly, personally believe they happened exactly like that, but I love those stories. Because I love those stories because they give me a lot of meaning. And that's what I'm really after. History is nothing but the search for meaning. It's not about facts. Facts are variable, actually. One day we think one thing, 20 years later they discover something else, and there's a new fact to be had. So fact is always evolving. But meaning is something deep and encoded in our myths and these stories. So that's another important thing to think about. So whether it's the language of the gods or whether it's the language of this thing, you know, these are all debatable kinds of things. But let's get to the point of why it's called Devavani, why it has this thing. Because that's part of the creation of this prestige, this authority, this power. And we'll talk about more. Okay. So yesterday, Kapilji asked us, you know, if Sanskrit died, then it must have been born. Very correct. If something dies, it had to have been born. If it has an anta, it has an adi. So what is this birth of Sanskrit then? What is this thing that we're always talking about? Well, we really have to talk about Panini. You can't have a discussion about Sanskrit unless you have a discussion about this incredibly important figure, not only of Indian thought, but of world thought. And I'm not an expert on the subject. I studied some Panini with a very good Vyakarani, who's an excellent teacher. I learned a lot of things. And what I learned was this is like an amazing system that someone thousands of years ago came up with to describe a language with absolute beauty, precision, and compactness of thought. One thing that Panini does in Astadhyayi is he makes a distinction between Chandas and Bhasha. So Chandas was the term that he used for the Vedic language. That's different from the language that he calls Bhasha. Bhasha is what we generally call regular classical Sanskrit these days. And there are some differences that he shows that happen between Vedic and classical. So this is important to remember. It's also important to remember what these two words mean. Chandas means what? It is written in a meter. Means all these hymns, all these riks, all these things in the Vedas are written with a meter in mind. So he called it Chandas. But then he called this other language Bhasha. Bhasha is now something that we would understand to be something that's spoken. Bhas comes from the root to speak. So in that case, is Panini telling us that classical Sanskrit was a spoken language? I think maybe he was. But that was before Panini did what he did. And the important thing to remember about Panini now is that these words are really important. This Ashtadhyayi, the great 8 chapters of the grammar, are prescriptive, not descriptive. What does that mean? Panini didn't go around and listen to all people speaking and say, oh yes, I hear them speaking this and I hear them speaking that, and I'm writing down a grammar about what is being spoken. But that's what descriptive means. You're describing the language and you're defining a grammar of that language. Partially he did that, no doubt about it. But what he really did was to create prescriptions. What should be done, and also what can be done. Even today, following rules of the Paninian grammar, you can go on creating hundreds of new Sanskrit words that anybody who knows the basic rules of Sanskrit will be able to understand. Panini gave us the tools for an unlimited amount of language production, actually. He did not define the language of that time and put a circle around it and say, this is what it is. What he did actually was look at a language that was being spoken-ish, let's say. I don't want to say it was fully spoken, but let's say something that was kind of in circulation. Taking that, he extrapolated a set of basic rules that could confine this language in that way and make it available to create any number of words based on those rules. Now, as Kapilji mentioned, Panini, we know, lived in, northwestern India, maybe somewhere in Punjab, actually probably like in modern day Pakistan, we could say. Point is, that was the language that was present around at his time, in his area. And this is really important, it was the language of a very elite strata of the society. Panini says this, Patanjali says this, everybody says this. So I'm sorry to say, in contrast to Kapilji's statement about, Sanskrit just being available to everybody, it was not available to everybody. It wasn't even available to everybody, and you could argue it's not available to everyone today. Even my grandfather, who wanted to learn Sanskrit, was not allowed to learn. Not a Brahmin, didn't come from that family. No way. Crazy thing is, my grandfather left his home and went to Lahore. This is before, independence. Went to Lahore to learn Sanskrit. See how funny that sounds now. But it's true. Lahore was a great center. In fact, that's basically around where Panini is from. And it was a great center of Sanskrit learning, actually. Anyway, the point that we really have to understand is Sanskrit was based on an elite language, a language of elite people. And this is what Patanjali in his Mahabhashya calls shishtas, high society. And what he's doing, Panini, is defining basically how do you speak in the most refined, high way. That's what Sanskrit is. So there's a lot of, as I was mentioning, there's a lot of debates. Madhav Deshpande, by the way, fantastic scholar. If you want to read more about these kinds of debates, about, linguistic world in India, socio-linguistic milieu that Panini was in, look at his work. He's a fantastic scholar. So he sets up these different things. Like some people say that the language that Panini was using was just the common language. Everybody used the language. And that's what he did. He went and kind of codified grammatically that particular living language. Other people say, no. There was no language at all. This Panini is Ashtadhyayi is so perfect, so kind of computer perfect, so mathematically, logistically perfect that he must have just made it up. That wasn't actually a spoken language at all. He was just based on like pure thought. There's some people that believe that. And like in many things, the answer is probably somewhere in between. So like I'm saying, my perspective on it is basically you had an elite language that was codified to perfection by this person in the Ashtadhyayi. It did have elements of, the spoken language. So in a sense, it's somewhat descriptive of that moment in time, but not descriptive of the entire language or all the other things that happen around it, but more so that it was prescriptive to give all the possibilities for the formation and development of all sorts of new words and morphological changes. Yes. Again, tough to date Panini, but some people say 6th century BC, some people say 4th century BC. So, around Buddha's time, let's say, maybe a little after, maybe I would say. I tend to think a little later, like 4th century. Okay, let's keep going. So Sanskrit, Prakrit, and Panini, let a little bit more about this. So one of the ways that these two terms are looked at, as I was saying, is, and we've talked about this Marga Desi, it's been a big theme throughout all of the IKS lectures. So Sanskritam is the Marga, it's the way, it's the perfect way, it's like well-defined, and it's singular. It's universal. Whereas the Prakrits are many and diverse and naturally evolving and moving along and, plural. So these kind of contrast between these two is important to think about. The most important thing, though, that I really want to stress is this idea of Sanskrit power. How did it gain this sense of authority and stuff like that? So one particular scholar, well-known in the West, well-known in India too, is Sheldon Pollock. He wrote a famous book, The Language of the Gods and the World of Men. Everyone should read that book, if only to critique it, which I did a lot in my thesis. Although I did also appreciate many of the things that he formulated in that. One of them was the idea of what he called the Sanskrit cosmopolis. Cosmopolis. Cosmopolis, what does that mean? The universe in the city, the universe at home. Means how could Sanskrit spread in this way to all these parts of, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Northwest Asia? Why was it able to do that? And nobody went with a danda saying, time to speak Sanskrit. There was a cultural spread that was very powerful. It is, in a sense, a cultural hegemony. That's the word they often use, like some kind of cultural power that was created, not by some kind of military, but by a cultural power. And that cultural power is really, ingrained in the world of what Sanskrit is. And I have to say, mostly through the people that produced it, who were Brahmins. I mean, yes, we have some cases of non-Brahmin Sanskrit writers, but for the most part, in ancient times and even up until the present day, mostly Brahmins are the group that, work in Sanskrit. Okay, so let me read you this quote. just to show this kind of idea of, what this means. The work Sanskrit did was beyond the quotidian. So that quotidian means that everyday stuff. It's not a hello, how are you kind of language, right? It was directed above all towards articulating a form of political consciousness and culture. And again, politics not as transaction of material. So it wasn't to do like, I gave this much donation. Those were often done in Prakrits, those kinds of inscriptions. Not recording of deeds and contracts and tax records, but as a celebration of aesthetic power. Aesthetic power. That's an amazing thing. Culturally powerful language. So again, this Sanskrit cosmopolist is something that's fixed. Sanskrit doesn't change over time. It applies to everything in it. So it's a pan-Indic kind of language. It's somehow eternal, it's cosmic, it's divine. All of these things get attached to this language. But many of these ideas of Sanskrit are also, we have to realize, self-perpetuated by the tradition itself. I mean, who wrote the text that told you that Sanskrit was a great language? A Brahmin writing in Sanskrit. This is how power works, though. Not to say this is anything, weird. One other point, and this is some stuff from my thesis, but, it's also important to remember there isn't actually just one Sanskrit. There were many Sanskrits. You can tell, especially like when Sanskrit moves to South India, you can tell like a South Indian Sanskrit writer as opposed to an older North Indian Sanskrit writer. They have a different way of, using words, et cetera, et cetera. There's morphology. Even Panini describes, variations in Sanskrit, but it's because Panini chose one of those to define as like the correct one, the right one, that Sanskrit becomes somewhat, singularized by Panini's endeavor. Is this all making sense? Okay, let me try to get through this quickly. So sometimes I get talking and, So one other important thing, these Prakrits, as we know, they basically evolved to be, modern Indian languages, especially, North Indian languages, let's say. Hindi, Marathi, Punjabi, Gujarati, Bengali. There were also South Indian languages. We have to remember this is a huge thing, which I'm not even going to get into a big discussion on this point, but the Dravidian languages and their relationship to Sanskrit is a big topic to discuss. And the influence of Dravidian languages on Sanskrit is another big topic to discuss. But for our purposes, let's think about the fact that in the olden days, no one used Gujarati or Telugu or Kannada for writing poetry. They used it for, hello, how are you? What are you doing? Or local kings would use it to say, this, king donated this much money to create a well in this place. So all the things that Pollock was saying that Sanskrit wasn't doing was done by these other languages. But then, around 1000, and this is where the big change happens. First, basically in Kannada was the first one I would say that really vernacularized in that way. Tamil, of course, is a different case, which again is a big subject that I can discuss later on. But these languages said, okay, we like Sanskrit, that's good, but we want to write in Kannada now. We want to write great kavya in Kannada. We want to write great kavya in Telugu. Then later on, it happened in Gujarati and Marathi. And interestingly, if you remember Kapilji's point about bhakti, how it started in the south and moved all around, you remember that? Same thing. Bhakti and vernacularization of Indian languages go hand in hand. This is a major, big theme that needs to be unpacked a lot, but it's something very important to remember. Bhakti and vernacularization go hand in hand. It's a parallel kind of movement. Expressivity of local languages and the Bhakti movement and like expressivity of an individual sense of religiosity. Now you can understand why that might be true. If all ritual was performed by Brahmins in the Sanskrit language, Bhakti challenges that. And one of the ways it does that is by using these local languages, what we call the Desha Bhashas. So this is what we call the cosmopolitan vernacular. This is when the vernaculars start getting used. Of course, this is also happening again in cities by Brahmins who are Sanskrit speakers or Sanskrit users first, but local language users also, who then start to create literary versions of their vernacular languages. So a cosmopolitan vernacular is a vernacular aspiring to a cultural dominance through the appropriation of features of a superposed language. So in this case, of course, the language is Sanskrit. So to give you an example of that, for example, Nannaya, which also Kapilji mentioned yesterday, Nannaya was the kind of Adi Kavi of Telugu. He wrote the Andhra Mahabharata in Telugu. So basically it's writing the Bharata in Telugu. There's also a lot of discussion to be had about this. Why did he choose the Mahabharata? Well, the Mahabharata is a Sanskrit text. It's Sanskrit. It involves all that world of Sanskrit culture is contained within a text like that. And now we're going to move that text into Telugu. So that's what Nannaya did. And just to correct from yesterday, Nannaya wrote 2.5 books. And then later on, Tikkana wrote the rest, actually. And only Pragada finished the 3rd book and wrote the Harivamsha. So that's a little correction. Sorry, Kapilji from yesterday. But main point is, Nannaya started it around 1000, 11th century, somewhere in there. What's very interesting is, Nannaya also wrote this thing called Andhra Shabda Chintamani, which was the first grammar of the Telugu language. Now, what's really interesting is the first grammar of the Telugu language was not written in Telugu. It was written in Sanskrit. Because the vocabulary needed to talk about samasas and nouns and verbs and kriyas and all this stuff, all the language of that was in the language of Sanskrit. It wasn't in the language of Telugu. All the concepts of a grammatical, treatise were in the language of Sanskrit, not in Telugu. So this is a very interesting thing to think about. At the early stages when, a new language is kind of coming up or a new paradigm is arising, the only language that new paradigm has is the older paradigm. So even as Telugu is becoming its own, it's so much relying on Sanskrit forms and ideas, even in terms of defining itself as a language. Later came Appakavi. He was another Telugu grammarian, but this is now, he's 17th century. This is like 600 years later. And he's talking about Nannaya. He's saying the lawmaker of language here is a reference to Nannaya, was composing in Sanskrit, where no Telugu can be used. He gave the rules alone without even one example. That's why some of the rules were unintelligible, and that's why he felt at this stage, I can write a Telugu grammar about Telugu, explaining the Sanskrit grammar of this language. So what I'm trying to show is that 11th century is the beginning of this vernacular process. Now you have to go 600 years later, you see how the language is now kind of coming into its own. Okay, now just to finish up with quotes about this idea, what I was just saying, why bhakti, why all this stuff is happening, why all of these things are related. It's because at this kind of period, Sanskrit has now lost that ability to be that powerful language that conveys emotions. It still remained the great authority of Vedic knowledge, even Shastric knowledge. Shastras were written in that. But it lost its power as that language that could really express the heart. You couldn't write bhakti literature in Sanskrit, just wouldn't work. So our bhakti, this is him writing about Latin. It's kind of a similar situation happened with Latin, although there's obviously differences, but a purely artificial language. It became, that's what he's saying about Latin, purely artificial language written according to ancient models and often degenerating into a pedantic puzzle. Means it's too high, incapable of expressing the life of the times, right? It became really detached from the day-to-day thing. So Sanskrit of the 2nd millennium was ideal for encoding systematic thought. So the Shastras, scientific thought, was still written in Sanskrit at this time. But expressive literature, poetry, plays, all this kind of stuff went down because now the vernacular poets, now the Telugu, Kannada, Gujarati, Marathi, these writers are coming up and saying, look, this is really moving stuff. And these languages now have the ability to write literature. And last, in a way, this is my Parama Guru, Ingalls, was a very great Sanskritist. This is what he wrote about what he felt also kind of happened to Sanskrit by this late period. So Sanskrit was not a language of the family. It furnished no subconscious symbols for the impressions which we receive in childhood, nor for the emotions which form our character in early adolescence. Sanskrit was therefore divorced from an area of life whence the poetry of what I would call the natural language derives much of its strength. So Sanskrit kind of lost that expressive potential. And by doing so, in a way, it heightened its power as this like sacred, powerful, detached language of the gods, of a cosmic nature. It was quite interesting, what's happening to Sanskrit over time. So I don't know if any of you are Game of Thrones fans. Maybe, yep, there we go. So you know the Iron Islands. So what is dead may never die. This is really the point I wanted to bring home in today's talk. So my argument at a certain level is Sanskrit is a living tradition because Sanskrit actually never maybe lived. Sanskrit is not dead because Sanskrit was always dead. Panini killed it. Panini killed Sanskrit in the sense that he froze that language of his time in such a perfect, encased form that it ceased to kind of grow and exist and evolve like many languages do. It is that encasement, it is that kind of death sentence that also gave it its beautiful life and also its immortality. Now, this is kind of heavy stuff to think about, but think about it. What is dead may never die. So Sanskrit lives because of its non-living. It can never die because it's always been dead. This is really interesting to think about. And when there is a challenge to it, it comes back even harder and stronger. What does that mean? That means during the vernacular period, when people said, oh, Sanskrit, we don't need you anymore. You're not expressive enough. We have our own new vernacular languages. This is when Sanskrit actually becomes even more powerful. It becomes now truly like the language of the gods, the language of the elites, the language of ultimate knowledge. Because you could write a text in Telugu, okay, but if you wrote it in Sanskrit, that has power, even more power. So at a time when Sanskrit power seems to be dwindling, one could argue that its power even increased. That would be my contention. At least its perception as, again, this language of authority and power. Okay, so in just a few minutes, I'll give quick examples from some of the texts I work with, just to show what I mean by this. So Sanskrit, a text, we're not talking about the spoken language. Basically, it's this literal, written, composed language, let us say. A Sanskrit text then has like this lifespan to it. It's composed at a certain time, but exists in many forms. Like what I was saying, this is where the production, commentary, and translation. So even, take Panini. Okay, Panini writes, Ashtadhyayi, just little sutras. It's amazing. Boom, it's done. Then you need Patanjali to come along and explain what's going on, because there's a lot of things not everyone understands about all this. So you have Patanjali. Then you have so many other commentators that come after that that are explaining Patanjali or adding some new text or creating smaller versions of Paninian rules. Lagu Siddhanta, this Siddhanta, Katyayana, so many grammarians. I mean, it's like a tradition. So this one text gave birth to a whole lineage of people. And look, I mentioned Deshpande or Cordona, the great Sanskrit Paninian scholar. All these people, they're still writing about Panini. We're still talking about it right now. It's like the life goes on. And remember, really interesting, you could argue that Panini might have probably wrote sutras small because people had to memorize everything. And my teacher used to say his teachers would teach him that they should just memorize all the Paninian sutras. So he said, as a boy, I used to climb over my neighbor's fence with my friends and steal mangoes and sit there eating mangoes and reciting Paninian sutras, not knowing at all what those sutras meant. That's the Indian way, just kind of rote memorization. And then later on, you'll learn what they meant. In modern systems, we want to know everything properly first and then, learn it. Like same thing in music. I mean, my guru never taught me about arohis, avarohis, this thing, that thing. He's just like, play this. Don't ask any questions. Later on, after like 10 years, then I started asking questions. There's a difference in system. But so what I'm saying is it started orally. Panini, I'm sure, composed orally, no doubt about it. Then all these Mahabhashyas in this later tradition, that's all written. Something's gone. Yeah, that was all written down. And now, like I'm saying, Cordona, Deshpande, all these people, Kapilji, all these great scholars, they're not writing in Sanskrit, though. They're writing in English. It's a whole new language we had. Because now, English has taken that position of power. Nobody gives a damn if you write something in Telugu anymore. But if you wrote it in English, wow. You can't write your thesis in Telugu or Hindi or Marathi. Nobody will even care. People can't even read it. You don't have the vocabulary to talk about electromagnification. You need English to do that. Just like Nannai had to write his grammar in Sanskrit, we now have to write our papers in English. Because that's the language that has that power now. It's very interesting to think about these things. So, for example, the Natya Shastra. This is like the, root text. The same thing that I explained about Ashtadhyayi, same thing. Natya Shastra is this root text. Bharata, maybe second, maybe later, maybe earlier. Not sure. Has all sorts of things inside of it. Drama, music, this thing, that thing. But then you have a series of scholars that come. Dandan, of course, did Alankara Shastra, which was also contained in Natya Shastra. Abhinava Bharati, that was the text that Abhinava Gupta wrote, the commentary on Natya Shastra, was very important. That came in 11th century, so many years later, but still writing in Sanskrit. Then you get Sangita Ratnakara. Now there's a music text, again, 13th century, also written in Sanskrit. And then if we move forward, finally we start to get Kannada, Telugu, Tamil texts also writing about music. Because nobody's reading Sanskrit texts anymore. Now nobody's writing those texts in Telugu, Tamil, or Kannada. They're writing it all in English. So I'll just give you a quick thing because I know we want to wrap it up. One of the things that I also want to stress between the idea of how an intellectual tradition evolves versus a language like Sanskrit, where the rules are pretty much set up by Panini. It froze the language, stopped evolving. The ideas used in that language, the poetry written in that language, also that's all evolving, no problem. But the language itself is pretty much frozen. The tradition is evolving. So these traditions evolve by squaring up what is there in theory versus practice. What is spoken versus what is put in a grammar text. That's why all the Prakrits always had new grammars coming out. If you look at an old Prakrit grammar from before, they had to revise it because the Prakrit language, the speech of that language evolved, and then the guy had to write a new grammar to account for that. Whereas the Sanskrit, they're just honestly writing a new grammar. They're still just trying to figure out what Panini was saying because he was so perfect and wonderful. Even now we had this recent, breakthrough on Panini. No, it's not a breakthrough on Panini. Some guy, not some guy, somebody came up with an idea. In fact, it is good that shows that we're still sitting there thinking about Panini. It's not like he came up with a new Ashtadhyayi. No. So the point is that there isn't a recourse to squaring of theory and practice because Sanskrit is not a spoken language that needs to be, or the grammar needs to be updated because of changes of how people speak. But music, other things, music, now that's something that changes. And that's why you can see that in the Shastric literature, written in the Sanskrit language, evidences a clear, acceptance of the variability in practice and how that needs to be, updated and changed. The theory itself needs to change. So I'll just give some examples. These are all from, this is from Soramela Kalanidhi, which quotes, again, this is another text, Vijayanagara text, 16th century, which quotes Sarangadeva. So there's always this, you always have to quote your gurus in our tradition. That's very important. We didn't have like citation system, but this was the citation system. So he said, Sarangasuri, that means Sarangadeva, who is versed in matters contained in all the musical shastras, considered in his chapter on the instruments, the primacy of practice in Gana music. Or rather, and this is important, that the shastras themselves value the importance of practice. Therefore, a shastra that contradicts practice should not be followed. So shastra, prayoga, theory, and practice, right? Shastra is like shas, it's what's written, it's what should be followed. That's the theory. Prayog is what is used, what is practiced, what is done. Squaring these two things is what's happening here, which I'm arguing does not happen with Sanskrit as a language. Okay, the other terms important here, lakshya and lakshana. What should be observed and what is observed. So like what ought to be done and what actually is done. So again, whenever there are inconsistencies between theory and practice, the theory should be abandoned. Like Sarangadeva Suri, who resolved this in the Desi Ragas, theory ought to conform with what is expressed in Gana music. Therefore, establishing the primacy of practice substantiates theory. What a beautiful statement. So what I'm really getting at with all of this is to express one important thing, that the traditions themselves are living in a different way that Sanskrit is living. The traditions are living just the way that Prakrit languages and spoken languages are living, in the sense that they are evolving over time. When there's a change, we incorporate that into the new grammar. When a new raga comes, we change our definition of that raga, like that. This is not how the Sanskrit language is working, because no one's rewriting any Sanskrit grammars. People are just interpreting over and over, step by step. So it's a very different type of living. The livingness of the Sanskrit text and the livingness of the power of the Sanskrit language. These are two different kinds of livings, but they're very important and related to each other. So the last point, and this is probably where we should have some discussion and I'll pretty much end, but when people say that Sanskrit, what they're really saying is around that vernacularizing period, basically people stopped writing in Sanskrit. Yes, there are a few people that write in Sanskrit today, but you need a readership. You need people who are, it's not like people are publishing Sanskrit books and you have hundreds of people reading the Sanskrit book and writing book reviews of those Sanskrit books and having a big discussion. It's not a cultural milieu based around Sanskrit. In fact, most of the people that read Sanskrit these days are sitting around in Western European and American universities. People in India that might have read Sanskrit, and okay, maybe you read Sanskrit, but then you go to an IIT to become an engineer. Most Sanskrit scholarship now today is happening outside of India. And most Sanskrit scholarship, in fact, most scholarship period in the humanities are happening in the English language. Like I just did right before I came, I was like, let me just, if I type in Natya Shastra book, what will come up? And this is what I get. Everything's in English, one book is in Hindi. Nobody's writing a Sanskrit book about the Natya Shastra. You see what I'm saying? English has now become that language of power. It has become the language, the thing that Sanskrit had before as the language of the Shastras, as the language to express knowledge. That is now taken by English. So even now, when Sanskrit is continuing, you could say, its own life, because people love to read Sanskrit, it still has that prestige. Most people are reading those Sanskrit works through English translations. We're not teaching deep amount of Sanskrit reading to students. We're encouraging more of this. And this is, look, I'm not even saying it's necessarily a bad thing. I'm saying, look at the long history of all these things. This is how life goes. Languages have their heyday and their, not so much heyday. This is how it works. So we're in a period right now where there's a predominance of English in the academy. And really the core of the entire talk that it's the nexus between, people are always talking about power and knowledge. Yes, absolutely true. But the key to all of that is actually language. So on that note, last quote by Nietzsche, that which does not kill us makes us stronger. Sometimes you hear this quote a lot, but we're still here, Panini's still here, and hopefully it'll make us all stronger as we grow, learn more, and have more discussions. So I think we're at the time to stop. So thank you very much. Please feel free to email me. Thank you everyone for listening. You're a very nice audience and happy to have discussion. Thank you.